Hello there. A few of you have requested me to add narration to the plant and animal disease lectures, and so coming to you live from the cozy studios here in the Agricultural Education Center, we're going to bring you Unit 12 with narration here covering soybean insects. So let's jump into this stuff, and we'll see if this helps you out in terms of capturing some of the things that we're trying to get points across in this online section of plant and animal diseases. And as you see in Unit 12 here, we're going to focus on soybean insects throughout this. And start looking at a few content issues here. First, and I know that this has been mentioned in a number of other topics throughout the section, is just really carefully spend time scouting and monitoring your fields. Because you have both damaging and beneficial insects out there in the fields at all times. And so remember, when you go out to do some insecticide applications, not only do you kill the damaging insects, sometimes you also kill off the beneficial insects as well. So you have to know what insects are of risk and what insects out there are actually helping you out, and know what's going on in your field. Secondly, the next point listed here is really understand the economic thresholds for insect damage and cost control. So what that means sounds very scientific, and it's really not. It's basically a business decision. How much damage has to be caused before it's actually costing you money? And you'll actually find it takes a pretty severe amount of defoliation lots of times to actually cause severe yield losses in most of our insecticide problems. So make sure that you're using wise management strategies and getting out there and scouting your field, knowing what's out there in the field, and then pushing the pencil before you go out with an insecticide application to know what specifically you're targeting and how much expense that's going to add to your bottom line on inputs. Lastly, one insecticide application in most cases, I'll use that qualifier here, in most cases should be enough to control most infestations, but we will talk about an exception here later on. Jumping to the next slide, here's some guidelines, and I mentioned it generally takes a lot more problem than what we think about as you go out to the field. But when we talk about insect toleration, or what are those thresholds that might cause economic yield loss, is up to about 35% defoliation during blooming. So that might be, depending on planting time, let's just say late June, early July, something like that. And you don't see soybean flowers unless you get right out in the field. They're about the size of a pencil eraser, and most of the time they're either purple or white. That's the only two options that you'll find on soybean flowers. So it really takes 35% defoliation during blooming time to actually cause yield loss. That's the economic threshold. If we talk about insect challenges before blooming time, we're probably not talking about anything that's going to cause you a risk for severe yield loss, because they'll probably grow out of it at that point in time. Once you get to pod fill time, so those flowers have bloomed, we're getting towards setting pods and filling pods with soybeans that we'd like to combine later in the fall. We really would prefer nothing greater than 20% insect infestation or defoliation at that point in time during pod fill. So again, some key times that you need to be out there scouting your fields and looking at insect challenges and populations and determining whether we need to come up with an insecticide application. We're going to look at a couple different categories of insect problems or pests that are out there. And when we look at leaf feeders, the three big ones that you've got to worry about is the two-spotted spider mite, the bean leaf beetle, and the soybean aphid. And I've got some pictures here to show you what they look like. Shortcoming. So the spider mites always feed on the underside of the leaf, and will basically, what they're after is harvesting and sucking that juice, that rich in sugar, rich in protein for them, right out of the leaf of the plant. And once you see that, you'll oftentimes see kind of a yellow spotting, maybe sometimes some webbing. Those spider mites, they do actually spin a wee bit of a web, and you'll see a bit of a crinkling to the leaves sometimes. And the severely infested leaves will actually die. They'll suck enough juice out of those leaves to basically bleed them dry. So we'll get out there and watch for those spider mites, but again, they'll be on the underside of the leaf. So as you're walking through the field, if you don't occasionally stop and turn over a leaf and look on the underside, you may miss those guys out there. Next is the bean leaf beetle that feeds again on the leaves, causing some defoliation. As we transition to the next slide, you'll also see these feed on the pod, and so you'll see scarring and seed damage. And so here's one that has actually a pretty low economic threshold, and generally I would suggest that these are bigger challenges, bigger problem causers during pod fill time than they are during the vegetative or flowering stage. So once you hit about 5 to 10% of pod damage due to bean leaf beetles, to get out there, probably it's worth it with an insecticide application to kill them. Larvae of the bean leaf beetle feed on roots and root nodules, so there's maybe a bigger challenge yet to get out there and your fields for it. So here we have the bean leaf beetle, and notice we see some different sizes and shapes and color spotting to the bean leaf beetle. So you'll generally find a lot of examples of these, like a yellow one on the left with some spots, or a plain brown one on the right. Here's an example of a green one feeding on a pod, and there's what we would consider pod damage. So it looks superficial in nature, that's maybe not going to get through and damage the developing soybean on the inside, but you'll actually find lots of those soybeans in the pods. If you have severe bean leaf beetle infestations, some of those beans will be damaged or shriveled or won't develop, or even you'll get abortion of the developing soybean within the pod if it's severe enough. So make sure that you're, again, out there scouting for these kind of problems. It's not uncommon at all to see these insects in the fall, late summer, early fall, buzzing around the farm or out in the field. Just stop and watch your pods. Do some scouting. Get out in the field. See what's happening, because they will cause enough damage if there's enough of them. But it's pretty rare to have to get out and do an insecticide application. Soybean aphids really is a problem of just the last 20 years or so, and identified around 2000. And so we're learning more and more about them. They tend to overwinter, the eggs do, on buckthorn plants, which we have a few around here. And here's the real challenge with soybean aphids. You'll see 18 generations a year. They have a very, very erratic and vigorous lifestyle. Colonies increase, they spread, and then right away some things will happen and that colony will die off. But usually they are leaf feeders. They will feed on the stem, but mostly leaf feeders, sucking, again, that fluid, that good sugary juice right out of the soybean leaves. And you can actually see these from the road when you're driving. You won't see the insects, but you can see the impact of them. You'll see kind of big patches of soybeans that should be normally nice and healthy and green will turn a bit of a darker color or almost grayish, and those leaves will cup or crinkle. You can see that from the road. If you get out there and walk through the field, then you can find those aphid problems out there if you, again, turn the leaves over and look for them. Reduced yields, we know in China is where this problem originated, almost by a third, because of the severe foliar damage that they can cause whenever they are allowed to just keep going crazy and keep populating. So, but they're very difficult to treat, and I mentioned those populations can crash because of just simple weather changes. You could have a rain event come along and just crush a population that was starting to really cause a potential yield loss for you, and therefore then it's not worth treating it. There is a little bit of, I mentioned beneficial insects out there. There's a little bit of predatory control. There's some, I believe ladybugs feed on these things and so forth. But predatory control, once you get a severe infestation, is probably not going to take care of it. Here's the real challenge. Infestation levels can increase tenfold in a week. So you may scout a field on Monday and not really find much of anything, or maybe notice a little bit of aphids, but it's maybe not worth your time and effort and expense to go out and get the spray rig or call in an order and get your field sprayed for you. But by the following Monday, you may have a severe problem. So these are insects certainly to watch, because in a week's time, that population can be really problematic. And the insecticide only controls the current population. It won't necessarily prevent a future infestation. So sometimes this is one of the few that may take 2 applications to control if you don't get them completely eradicated in the first shot. Here's a picture of what those things look like, and again, this picture obviously is zoomed in quite a bit, but you can see these things pretty easily with the naked eye. Again, this picture is zoomed in a long way, but these things are probably about the size of the tip of your pencil, but clearly green in nature, and that's mostly because of the chlorophyll-filled juice that they're sucking out of the soybean plant there. So, but again, you got to turn that leaf over to find these things most of the time. They don't survive in the sunshine that well, so they like the cover of the underside of that leaf. But you can again start looking for those crinkled and cupped leaves and big patches of them out there, and you'll probably find soybean aphids will be a problem occasionally for you. And then some years you'll never hear or see of it, and in some years they're great big problems. This is an example of a trial that was done. I think this picture is taken in central Illinois, and on the left is a non-treated soybean aphid infested patch. On the right of your screen here is an insecticide applied soybean aphid infested patch, and you can see the severe defoliation and severe challenges that this created. And actually I've seen overhead pictures where a spray rig or a plane came in and sprayed, and where it couldn't get up to, say, the grain legs up there at the top of the picture, you saw great big brown patches where the aphids were allowed to just go crazy and just basically kill off what you have for a crop there. So on the left you see what looks like beans that might be ready to harvest, and that's actually not the case. That's beans that have been so severely defoliated by soybean aphid infestations that it basically stripped the leaves right off of it and killed the plant down. And so yield is going to be pretty severely impacted by a third or more there. Here's another picture, and I said that's where you find them on the bottom side of that leaf. Again, green or dark green, light green or dark green in color, usually buzzing around, kind of hanging around on the bottom of the leaf. So make sure and turn those leaves over again when you're out there scouting. Next picture you see, or next slide that we'll transition to, talks about pod and flower feeders. So basically, these are direct yield reducers, because most of the time we're talking about insects that will feed right on the flower bud itself, or feed right on the pod and clip it off until it falls on the ground, which obviously is going to cause direct yield damage. So when we look at damaging insects, we're talking about bollworms, stink bugs, the Mexican bean beetle, and grasshoppers, and we'll go through here. The clover worm, the velvet bean caterpillar. And so how do they cause damage? Like I said, most of them are basically they're pod clippers, or feeding on what would be a pod, which is the flower. So this is a stink bug right here. You've seen a number of these. Again, it takes a pretty severe problem for them to be clipping off enough or feeding on enough pods to cause severe yield loss. But again, a bug that you've seen pretty commonly out there. Here's a bollworm, again, that will feeds on the flower or feeds on that young developing bud or pod coming along. So you want to certainly look for that guy out. The Mexican bean beetle, you'll see that one occasionally out there, again, pod feeder. Next one, the green clover worm. This is not one that I find very often whenever I'm scouting my own fields, but again, they will clip the pods right off. Lastly, the stem feeders, and so these would be the least problematic of all of the ones that we've talked about in this section, because they rarely cause what we would consider a severe enough economic loss to ever warrant an infestation, but you certainly need to be aware of what they are. They do have strong enough mouth parts to actually puncture the stem and suck the juices right out of the stem, but rarely are they able to suck enough at a time and keep that hole open and drain enough that it actually kills very many of the plants in the field. So a couple problem pests out here are the three-cornered alfalfa hopper and the weed borer, and you'll see some pictures. Here's that three-cornered alfalfa hopper. The seed and seedling feeding insects, again, these are really more what we target when we talk about treated seed and soil applied insecticides. These are problematic because they can absolutely decrease your stand before it even gets out of the ground. So you certainly want to know what problems that we may have developed. And some of the damaging pests are listed on this slide, and the most common ones for us would be the seed corn maggot, the wireworm, the grub. There's that bean leaf beetle down there. The southern corn rootworm can cause some of the. Here's the picture of the grub. Here's the wireworm, and I know especially these are problematic if you have soybean fields right next to a pasture or what used to be pasture, or a field that is right next to wheat. Oftentimes you can dig up and find these wireworms. They're kind of hard-shelled. This is one of the harder shelled worms that you'll find. Kind of crunchy if you step on them. So there's one that you might find regularly here in Southern. There's a grape colaspis. I've seen a few of these, but not often in our part of the seed corn beetle, which is maggot, which is this one right here. Here's a picture of one that's fed enough into infested a soybean stalk enough that obviously that sucker's going to break right off, and you're going to not have a developing plant there. A thrip, again, a small little insect that probably doesn't cause that much challenge for us. So some take-home messages here as we finish up this section. Just a quick little 15-minute chat about soybean insects. They can cause severe yield losses, though it's somewhat rare to find it happening for you out there. You need to be aware of what the challenges are. Infestations can and often are weather related, and so as you see maybe a advantageous weather situation developing that insects will proliferate, it would certainly be in your best interest to be thinking about getting out of the pickup truck and going and scouting some of your fields and actually walking through, doing a good scouting procedure to see if insect infestations are out there. So scout carefully and regularly, manage your insect pressure, and then push the pencil carefully to know whether it's worth it to go outside, go out there with the spray rig and spend the money to try and knock down an insect infestation. Rarely do you find it pencils, but you do need to be aware that that might be a risk. So hopefully that's helped in Unit 12 and clarify some things as we go along, and this will add to some of the things. I'll try and get the rest of the lectures recorded for you to take us home to the rest of the semester. Thanks for listening.